is a leading light in the permaculture movement. For about the last 20 years, he's been working in the design, implementation and consulting and research into permaculture systems in the UK and Europe-wide. And Tomas has been on the Permaculture Research Advisory Board. He helped or led on the permaculture research strategy for the UK. And since about 2010 has been working on research to do with polyculture systems and forest gardens, which is what Tomas is going to partly talk about today. So I think, for us, this is really exciting for us to get to hear more about this work, but also to see how it fits with our work and how we can maybe talk about collaborating with Tomas in some of the areas he's been working in as well. So, there'll be lunch afterwards to have a chat with Tomas about this, and then maybe in the afternoon if individuals want to stay on and see where we can go with Tomas from here in terms of research. Okay, thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction and thank you for inviting me today. I don't have to introduce myself now, so that's great. Just to give you a brief outline of what I'm talking about today, so it'll be about 45 minutes I expect, then there'll be time for questions and answers, and that's kind of carrying into lunch break, of course. And I have no rush to get back from here, so so there's plenty of time to chat afterwards and discuss things. So the overview of the actual talk I'm giving, I've called it Real Life Forest Gardens, which is also the title of the book I'm just about finishing the manuscript on, so next year that should be out and published. And what it is really, it's a review of practice of forest gardening over the last 20, 25, 30 years, so since the concept has been started in the 80s. That's the core of kind of my presentation today, so part of that review. Didn't know how much prior knowledge there is about forest gardening, food forests in this room, so I've got a brief synopsis of the basic ideas behind it, but also with bringing in some of my the review already, kind of so how I think how we could look at the concept from an ecological point of view. So then summary of some of the findings that I've come up with, from looking at 130, basically we've done a survey of 130 sites of baseline data across mostly Europe and the US and Canada. So that's fed in, and then I've done about 40 case studies, again, mostly Britain, some in Europe, some in Northern America, and there was both interviews and site visits, so knowing that's fed into that. So you get a bit of a review of kind of what's come out of that, showing some of the potentials, some of the challenges, and some of the lessons and questions that have come up from that. And what I want to finish with is, what Julia already hinted at, is how do agroforestry and forest gardening, forest gardening as a practice, agroecology as a discipline, research discipline, how do they come together, and how can we bring them together in order to advance both, really. So that's what you can expect. Unfortunately, I've got 3 presentations that I'm trying to turn into one. That's limits of the technology I need to play with. So, basic aspects of forest gardens. So just to give a look at kind of where the idea came from, so I've just listing 3 of the key figures, or 4 in fact, and kind of where they come in and what they bring to the table, if you want. So there's Robert Hart, whose name you may be familiar with from, he is credited really as the originator of the idea of temperate forest gardens, and He developed that idea in the 1980s, brought out a little pamphlet that was kind of quite informally distributed and then turned into a book in the mid-90s. But the concept caught on quite quickly. And what he's combined really are ideas that he's taken from tropical home gardens. So he visited Kerala in South India and was really impressed by the abundance of home gardens there. He also was already working in agroforestry. Together with a guy called Sholto Douglas, he produced a book called Forest Farming, which basically was summarizing ideas around agroforestry at the time. But another inspiration for him, and one that's often overlooked, is actually the English cottage garden, which I think is really interesting because we're talking about indigenous systems. We're immediately thinking India, Central American rainforest, whatever. Actually, we have indigenous systems all over the world, and like the combination of flowers, fruit, herbs, vegetables in an English cottage garden. Here we've got a homegrown polyculture, and Robert Hart really drew on that quite a lot. So his ideas primarily started spreading through Britain and Europe. That's where the term forest gardening really is very well at home. In Australasia, and in the Americas, people tend to talk about food forests more, and the reason for that is that basically that idea really came out of the permaculture writings of Bill Mollison, David Holmgren, again published in the 1980s, and that was again inspired by tropical and subtropical home gardens, but also by especially Bill Mollison's personal first-hand experience of living in rainforest areas, and his starting point was really there is this abundance of on every layer of production and efficiency. How can we bring that into domesticated, cultivated landscapes? And with a significant innovation an update on the whole project happened through David Jack and Eric Tunsmeyer's book Edible Forest Gardens, that was written came out in 2010, I think. And what we can thank them for really is a very thorough review of ecological knowledge and practice that really has brought up to date the whole ideas of forest gardening and compared them with up-to-date ecological knowledge, and really kind of modified quite a few of the original assumptions, which is, I think, really good to see that happening. Right, so if we're looking at the basic structural idea of forest gardening, and that's both we get the terms food forest, forest gardening, and they're very much interchangeably used in a lot of literature, which leads to some confusion sometimes, which I'll move on to a little bit later, and maybe how to move forward with that. But so in both concepts, there is the idea of a 7-layer model of vegetation of forest, which is really, in Robert Hart's case and also in Mollison's case, taken from tropical, observing tropical systems. So we've got large canopy trees, then smaller trees in what's called the understory, and shrubs. So those are the 3 main woody layers. And then below that we've got tall herbs. We've got another layer of herbs that cover the ground, or that can be dwarf shrubs sometimes. So that's generally what people call the herbaceous layer. Then there's there's the idea of a layer of root crops and the root zone, the rhizosphere, and then finally climbers who are using the vertical. So we've got the idea of those 7 layers, and Robert Hart really tried to transfer and transport that idea into temperate climates. Mollison and Holmgren, they really were working more in tropical and subtropical systems, so they never really updated or modified their ideas about that, and they didn't really have an awful lot to say about temperate systems. One thing that's might be worth looking at is how do forest gardens compare with other cultivation types? And for that, I find it enlightening to just overlay that with like the ideas of primary, secondary succession, and where do these different cultivation types fit in that succession model. So if we're looking at agriculture, most agriculture works with annual plants, and basically that really depend on bare soil. So basically we're looking at really the first stage of, like the very, very first stage of a succession, whereas forestry works really at the back end of succession, like when in the tree and climbing population stage. Horticulture, interestingly, really uses the whole spectrum of all parts of the succession, and so that's really where forest gardening has its playing field. We're talking about perennial plants, perennial herbs. We're talking about shrubs, small trees, and then taller trees. So we're really looking at a broad spectrum of succession stages. And if we compare that with other agroecological practices, that's quite interesting. Like agroforestry really tries to combine the front end and the back end of those successional stages, which I think might be interesting to actually look at what that means for what's going on in the soil, because like soils in woodland is very different to soil in bare fields. So what the soil interactions and like soil building processes, use process of soil are like. So that's one of many research questions that we might ask ourselves. If we're looking at forest gardens as functional ecosystems, there are a whole different types of yields. There's a lot of potential for different types of yields, and so I've grouped them into 4 different categories. So we've got ecological functionality and resilience around climate, soil, water, plants and wildlife. We've got a whole list of physical yields that often are the primary purpose for establishing those systems in the first place. We've got what you might call recreational or social yields as well, and then a whole lot of areas of learning that forest gardens can facilitate. And the learning side, I think in a way it's crucial to thinking about forest gardens, because forest gardens are actually, they don't take basically ideas like they don't take a lot of energy input, like physical energy, to put in to make them work. We're setting up processes that are self-sustaining, but actually what we've got is very knowledge-intensive systems. So we need to have a whole range of skill sets that make forest gardens work. And if you're looking at, we're looking at ecology, so understanding how natural processes work and how we work with them. Horticulture, actually how to work with plants in particular and the different plants we're introducing and the combinations. And design, so thinking about layout, thinking about functionality, thinking about establishment and maintenance patterns. And then ultimately, most forest gardens are not just run by one person, so we also need to think about how do we work together in the social skills. So there's actually quite a complex web of ideas going on. So what I want to do next is then to actually go and look at how do some of those potentials and some of those knowledge skill sets express themselves in different situations. So if you think about the yield potential, and this is an excellent example of what a forest garden can produce really physically. Graham Bell and Nancy Woodard live in the Scottish borders. We've got a relatively large back garden, 700 square meters, but they really make extremely good use of it, and they've really got the, I mean, that's one of the places where you can really see, you really feel you're walking through a woodland, you know, and you can eat fruit and left, right and centre, and herbs and leaves and what have you. So they, I mean, that figures 2 years ago, they had about over 1 ton of food from that like small space, which equates to something like over 13 tons per hectare. This year, when I asked them like about a month ago, they were already at 1.2 tons. So they, it's a 25-year-old system, so the yield's still going up, you know, after 25 years. I mean, they've got walnuts in there, which are only just beginning to come into production, you know, after 25 years. So can really see kind of a great yield potential there, and kind of a great contribution to like household resilience, if you want. Basically, they're getting fuel, they're getting foods, they're so all sorts of materials out of it. And that's not just at one point or like a small number of points through the year. That's all year round, you know. So there's really kind of creating stability in terms of food supply on a family level. And if we're looking at those skill sets, so that's one of the main. So I think there's two key factors that make that garden work so well. And one is that both Graham and Nancy have that triple skill set, like the core skills of forest gardens. They understand ecology, they are both experienced permaculture designers, so they've got that skill set, and also they really have worked with plants for a long time. And the second key factor for the success of this garden is that they have been there 25 years with the same system. We can really say that they've co-evolved themselves and the system, you know, so they've adjusted the garden to their needs, they adjusted themselves to the way the garden works, you know, so it's really a co-evolution going on there. And all the most successful gardens, I think, are the ones that have been had a continuity of management going on, whether that's in a private situation, whether it's in a community situation or commercial. Looking at some of the social potential, there are, I mean, if we're thinking most sites really are not just managed by one person. You know, you have a family, you have a lot of spaces are community gardens or run in public places. You know, there, so you've got very interesting edge situation, and there are different sections of the community can come together around or in the forest garden, and that offers all sorts of yield types. So there is obviously food, but there's also a lot of learning going on by the nature of that interaction. And again, people have said that actually the food is, you know, a lot of people appreciate it, but a lot of people appreciate just as much, if not more, the amount of connection they're getting with actually an evolving natural system, and like being able to work with that and experience that, especially in urban areas. And equally, the connection with people that goes on in those spaces, and actually spaces that facilitate people's interactions. So that is just as important. In order to make that work, make those skills, like realize those potentials, that fourth skill set of people skills really comes into its own. So if we're thinking about how those core skills that we mentioned, ecology, design, horticulture, are distributed, they're in community situations, social situations, they're usually not everybody has the same level of every skill. You know, they're distributed across people, very unevenly distributed. So the process of getting, like, passing skills on, sharing responsibility becomes really important, and so we need to find tools and processes that enable that. Ecological potential. So back to Graham and Nancy's garden, in Scottish Borders, they've got registers of fungi, of invertebrates, of birds. It's quite an impressive list just of that as well. So it's as well as being very productive, it's very diverse in all sorts of species. This garden is Birchfield's Park Forest Garden in Manchester, and that's been declared a biodiversity hotspot by the City Environment Department. So they did a survey and they found that the biodiversity in that particular part of the park is much higher than the rest of the park and the rest of the area. So it's a clear benefit there. There are quite a few other ecological landscape benefits that we might derive. Soil building, carbon capture, effects on water, but they haven't really been investigated in any depth at this point, because obviously a lot of that actually demands kind of technical skills or equipment that your average gardener won't have in their shed. So that's something that we're definitely the help of academic community would be really useful. Finally, commercial potential. There aren't at the moment an awful lot of commercial forest gardens about, which I think if we're looking at their lifetime of forest gardens, of trees, so that we haven't really got any mature forest gardens yet. So like the places like Graham Bell's or Martin Crawford's, and they're just approaching maturity. So we have the first generation in the ground, and we still really don't know how to make them best work. That's still a very much concept in development. Dave Jack, the garden that he's put in a botanical garden in Massachusetts, he calls it the edible ecosystem teaching garden, and for him, the point of that garden is really testing the concept. Actually, how can we make this work? What are the patterns that make it work? So, not many commercial gardens, forest gardens around yet, but what there is, there's actually quite a few innovative and interesting approaches already emerging. The one on the picture here is the Langerhorst family in Austria. It's a family business that's been going on. And they planted the garden in '89, the forest garden part of it. And it's another one of those where they hadn't heard of Robert Hart or of Bill Mollison. They just developed the concept out of their own understanding of their own the ecology that they're living in. And so what they've got is a grid of with a spine of fruit trees, fruit bushes next to them, herbs, and then clearings within that with annual vegetables. And what they're finding is that the interaction between the both the shelter effects, but also the other effects seem to be really good in terms of productivity and also of health of both the fruit and the vegetables. So it seems to be a very good layout. The figures on that slide are from Primrose Farm, which is a small market garden in the Welsh Borders. So they've got about a third of the site as forest gardens and polycultures. And so what you find in this place, in the Langerhorst case, and most other cases, forest garden, people don't go for planting a forest garden and that's the business, so that's the operation. Usually what they lend themselves to is really as support structures and complementary structures with other forms of land use, other forms of production. We'll be thinking about them as windbreaks, can think about them as providers of organic matter, can think about them as biodiversity reservoir to support pest control, can think about them as moisture regulators as well. So there's lots of landscape and ecological functions there. They also provide support materials like fuel, like poles or canes for annuals and so on. So we can use them to create structure in this space as well. So having open spaces like clearings like here for either vegetables or social functions or ponds for all sorts of purposes. So thinking about how do they fit into the wider picture of the site of the farm or of the landscape is really worth doing. Okay, so that's just like the different types of yield potential that there are. So I've got a slide for the next bit, so I just scribbled like lessons and questions really. But it's not all, as I think, forest gardens at this point ask as many questions as they give answers. So, I mean, so like looking at all those case studies, all those surveys, one thing that was really quite interesting for me is like that you could say like the 7 layers don't exist. Shock horror, So, but what I mean is like the 7 layers do exist, but they don't seem to exist like in the same space on any particular site. So that was quite a surprising finding for me. What you usually find is between 3 and 5 layers, which like your average gardener can fit in kind of sometimes there's just 2 in some patches, sometimes there are, like some people manage to push it to 6, but that actually already requires a lot of skill and expertise and long understanding of what you're working with. So, I was wondering kind of what are the reasons for this, and kind of so some thoughts on that. There may be light, like the lower light levels in temperate climates. That might be part of it. There is, for smaller gardens, obviously space is a limit, but then there's also the management complexity. Actually, the ability to like manage 7 layers and have them all healthy and productive and like doing well. So that is another limiting factor. So it's kind of that. I think that's that may be part of the answer, but that can be compensated by actually, and is often compensated by diversity of horizontal layouts. So rather than having like lots of you have diversity in height, but also across a site. So you can have like patches with trees, patches just with ground cover, patches that are mixed, and so on. And in a lot of places we find that sort of pattern, and kind of that actually allows for a lot of diversity to occur, creating different conditions. The edible ecosystem teaching garden I briefly mentioned. So that's David Jack experiments with forest analogues, of course, but he's also looking at scrubland types, heathland, grassland mimics, so actually think about how can we use different habitat types in order to produce like crops of various kinds. So that's on the 7 layers. Next one is the idea of guilds. Do they actually exist? So that's the idea. Guilds in coming out of the permaculture language, meaning plants that have functional relationships, beneficial connections with each other, and so the idea is that we can identify plants that will work particularly well together, and like put them together, and they sort themselves out. What was interesting for me was that, like the most experienced forest gardeners, a lot of them weren't really so bothered about that concept. So Martin Crawford says most plants get on with all, most plants. So that's his view. Graham Bell says the forest garden is the guild. So it's actually kind of the whole system. The diversity happens on the level of the whole system, not on individual like small patches necessarily. But then other people are like working quite consciously with that process, with that concept, and there's even a nursery in Bulgaria that sells like forest garden ready-made guild, So and I mean they're doing it as an experiment, so they want feedback from the customers to see is that particular thing working in lots of different places, or did it just happen to work in their place? So kind of how specific or how general can these combinations be? So on that one, the jury is probably out, and it would be an interesting thing to investigate. But I mean, what is clear is that diversity and understanding plant needs is key. So like functional diversity, genetic diversity, spatial diversity as well. Like those three types of diversity can come together and basically make for a resilient system. So then, I mean, what's really stood out for me was that, like the sheer diversity of scales, of settings, of functions that people kind of use forest gardens for. You know, so like on what scales people are using it. So in terms of scale, kind of the survey, we had 130 responses. The smallest one was a 5 square meter front garden, you know, where the person was using kind of forest garden thinking to create a diverse front garden. The biggest site was 30 hectares, you know, and so you're clearly talking about like this massive like orders of magnitude in terms of scale. And so the question is, are we really talking about the same thing here? And are the same principles really at work kind of and on those different scales? What's going on? So which raises issues around terminology, around classification potentially, but ultimately about kind of understanding the processes, the principles, and seeing whether they work at different scales in similar ways. And that's, in a way, kind of the forest garden, food forest kind of confusion in terminology. And it's probably partly explained through the fact that Bill Mollison works in Australia, you know, so the first thing you do is get 100 acres of land and then you start thinking. Whereas Robert Hart, basically his focus really was kind of his small, like rural backyards, backyard in Shropshire, you know, and so there's a different scale that kind of the original concept was applied to really. So maybe that is actually a blessing in disguise, and we can't think of food forests as the slightly larger, slightly wider scale, and forest gardens as the slightly more formal and definitely smaller scale. And if we're thinking on the whole, kind of like we can, kind of on the whole, it's a spectrum there. So there's kind of, it's hard to say whether that kind of small gardens are wild, are formal, large gardens are wild. You know, so there's probably a spectrum between formal and more wild, and then there's another spectrum between small and large sites, you know. Both of them kind of have interesting implications, you know, so, and that's, each garden will be somewhere on either of those spectrums from that. Which sort of starts leading us to some of the challenges that we might experience when working with forest gardens, or when trying to research forest gardens as well. So, I mean, one of them is really the question: how can we classify, understand that massive difference in systems? And so we've got each site will have different characteristics. The people involved with that site will have different needs, different resources and characteristics, and each garden will make the functions may be different, like in different sites. So we've got massive variation in all these three factors, and then the permutations just become endless. So the question is, how can we investigate that? But in a way, again, it's a blessing in disguise, I think, because basically what we're talking about is complexity, and basically nature is complex, forest gardens are complex, and we can't, basically, it's really something we can't take apart and kind of doing kind of this kind of old school kind of research. So we really have to develop ways of researching that do justice to the complexity of the situation that we're investigating. So that in a way they're perfect subjects for developing new approaches to research that work with complexity. So that's one challenge maybe. A few more. So system health. So That's like discussions with people in their forest gardens. Quite a few came up around that, and Bethan Stack, who works at Schumacher College, and she ran the forest garden at the college campus for a while. So for her, there were really questions about well, it's like some things about plant families. So we've got, I mean, the rose family is a classic case where in the tree layer and the shrub layer, the rose family is really heavily present, and so by having that, by relying heavily on like just one or a few families, do we create opportunities for pests and diseases? And just the whole way of like growing at high density, basically like what opportunities does that open up, not just for us, not just for biodiversity on the whole, but specifically for pests and diseases. So another aspect is kind of the fact that layers grow into each other, and so in terms of fruit pests and diseases, does that give them opportunity to actually climb through the herb layer and the understory into the canopy? So that's things that would be worth investigating. So system health as one, legibility. So that's really the question: what's growing here, and how do I eat it? How do I use it? Because especially if you're new to a forest garden, if you're new to the concept, then you might go in there and have no idea what you can eat, how you can eat it. So you can actually starve surrounded by food. And if you don't understand it, then that has impacts on management, on productivity, of course. So I think especially in community and public spaces where like non-experts are like a large part of the audience, I think there's then a responsibility to think about layouts or setups that help people navigate what's there and understand what's there and then make best use of it. So that might mean sometimes simplifying planting schemes, but then while still retaining benefits of diversity. So there may be trade-offs to think about if we work in public spaces and community spaces. And then the other aspect is one about aesthetics, so the wild aesthetics of forest gardening. How does that sit with kind of like people's perception of public spaces? Could that be beneficial in some places, or is that off-putting to people? So I think aesthetics have not played a massive role in kind of most people's like work with forest gardens. Well, I should qualify that aesthetics have, but formal aesthetics haven't necessarily. So there's some really interesting exceptions where people really have thought about kind of the formal aesthetics of a garden, and I think those actually could teach us a lot and give us a lot of ideas of like how does that concept transport into public spaces. So that's about like the idea of legibility, and finally succession. So like there's a threefold challenge there really. One is on the shorter term, thinking about waves of care and neglect, and again, whether that's in home gardens, on public spaces, community gardens, well, you often find, life takes over, so like you're having like in the decades that you're working with your forest gardens, there will be periods that you're just too busy to look after it much, like to give it much input. And in community spaces, key people may leave, so and then that's can have a knock-on effect on management, on productivity, on the aesthetics as well. So buffering those fluctuations, I guess, kind of is one challenge. And so the forest gardens are in a fairly good position in that they can cope for 1 or 2 years quite well with neglect. It's much less of a disaster than like if you're having an annual cropping system. After 2 years, you're just totally overrun with weeds. So they are more resilient in that respect as well in terms of management. But after a couple of years, like tipping points are reached where species get lost, where functionality declines and kind of your typical forest garden neglect disaster looks like. And basically you've got a fantastic healthy crop of nettles in the understory, which you can eat nettles, you can do a lot of things with them, but for most people that's probably a bit not quite enough. Really kind of the question is kind of like, well, one is about management planning and finding kind of the critical moments, the critical periods of intervention where you can rein in a system that has gone a bit fuzzy around the edges. And the other one is really treating the key people, the people who have the key skills within forest gardening. So the best the really good gardeners, people who are managing to pass on information, to work with other people, the people who have the understanding of the design of the space, making sure that those skills and that information is handed on, between people, especially when key people leave. So we need to see them in a way as key elements, almost like keystone species, that kind of. We need to get the information off them in some way before they leave. So that needs to be part of the long-term planning in a way. And finally, the third aspect of succession is the big question like how do spaces like this survive changes in ownership or in priority? Robert Hart's garden is one sad example where basically that's not accessible anymore because the people who inherited the space they don't want people in there and they're not interested in the garden. So and there's been quite a few gardens really that we've lost from sight because basically they're no longer available. So that's really which is a challenge for a long-lived system, and we have to think about again kind of a handover question. In some ways, kind of that starts to move into into a cultural challenge, really creating a culture where those sort of spaces are understood, appreciated, and used by enough people, so that kind of that handover process can easily happen. If there's only 20 of us who understand what that thing does, then probably it's not going to be maintained by many people. So that's a long-term thing. I'm just looking at the clock, and it's 1:45 now, and I could go on. Basically. So that's challenges. So I'll just give you a very brief summary. And then basically that's the bit about agroforestry and forest gardening. So basically, do stop me. So to summarize, forest gardens are a great learning opportunity, more than anything else at the moment. So it can teach us about ecology, about horticulture, about design, about working with nature and with each other. And really what they can help us achieve resilience and sustainability at personal, household and community levels. So they're kind of like scalable models of resilience, if you want. And in relation to those core skills, it actually can help us embed those skills in ourselves, in our communities, which again is a strategy for making our communities more resilient. Of course, very few of us start out with these skills, so the challenge in a way is to, the success of those spaces depends on the ability to develop and maintain those necessary skills, depends on continuity of management, and also on security of tenure in one way or another. So those are, then our task then may be to develop processes and tools to share and transfer that knowledge, like the necessary knowledge, and also to develop ways of sharing and transferring land management of long-lived agroecosystems. Which leads to the question, how do we as agroecology researchers and forest gardeners collaborate in the process of creating. Shall I go on?
Yeah. It's,
Another 5 minutes?
yes.
Okay, so
Yes. It's here.
where next? Great, so before I jump into the where next bits, I'll just like to look at where we are in terms of the relationship between agroforestry and forest gardening, so where we come from, where we're heading. So for the first 15, 20 years of forest garden practice, it's really been on a parallel track with agroecology. So I think agroecology over the last 20, 30 years has made great progress in understanding the ecology and how it relates to cultivated systems. Forest gardening has also done that, but very much from a practical and kind of engagement with the system and kind of almost like ethnobotany, amateur science, you know. So it's kind of where it hasn't really been like a structured scientific process by any means, but a lot of knowledge has been accumulated by a lot of people and has been passed on. I mean, what's in some ways you could call the first phase of forest garden probably the romantic or naive phase. You know, if you're looking at the garden here in Brighton, don't know who's seen the forest garden here. So a few people have.
They might not realise it's meant to be a forest garden.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. So I think the gardeners are keeping it like under wraps because they're not very impressed with it. Rightly so, and I think there's good reasons why it's not a brilliant example for to copy, because where people thought, okay, yeah, trees, understory, shrubs, everything there, and then 10 years later you're standing there and how do you get to the fruit? You know, how do you get to the cherries and what have you? And because you end up with quite a shady spot, and there isn't all that much growing underneath that you recognise that you can eat. You know, and so it's definitely like one example of naive forest gardens, as I call it. But people, those who are the same people who now have like a ton of fruit in their site, you know, so they really have learned from that and moved on. So practitioners generally, in terms of like a connection between agroecology and forest gardening, some practitioners have helped themselves to ecological knowledge, you know, so where they could find it, but there hasn't really been an active dialogue till very recently. So I think we're just moving into that stage, you know, where I think the edible forest gardening books by Jack and Tensmeyer were a bit of a milestone in that respect, where they really reviewed like ecological understanding to that point in the practice and integrated that into like the design and maintenance of forest gardening. And at the same time, some researchers are starting to get interested. There are actually some sites to research now, so researchers are coming and getting into that. And ultimately, I think where we want to be is where there is a collaborative development going on, you know, where practice is embedded in theory and vice versa. You know, where we've got forest gardeners who have the skills and resources to do their own research on their own site and share that with others, and where researchers can go deeper into specific questions, but also researchers can start helping us develop like some of those tools and methods that like help us to understand forest gardens. And I mean, one piece of good news is that that process, when we started that process at the International Permaculture Conference this September, where like a few of us kind of kept meeting like through like the whole week that we were together, and so there was a mix of people who've got their own site and just getting on with their practice, and researchers, and that dialogue was really starting to happen, and that has led to, as you asked, kind of pushing forward what we're starting to call the Food Forest International Research Network, which is part of the Permaculture International Research Network. So we're under that umbrella, we want to start that off, and so we're already in the process of producing a baseline survey that will go out not just in temperate climates but worldwide, so we can compare across climate zones as well. And we're developing an ongoing survey, so once a year, once every 3 years, people can check in and give updates on how they're progressing, so we can start to see also the evolution of sites over time. And we're developing just a database of people on the practice and on the research side that want to collaborate. So hopefully that means that over time we're really building up our capacity to understand forest gardens. So the goal of thinking about this stage, the goal then maybe could be to collaboratively develop and study complex agroecosystems, which forest gardens are an example, and develop ways of understanding and improving those, actually, and start developing the research side as well as the practice side. So developing skills and resources for forest gardeners to do research, with researchers actively participating in creating those skills and resources.
Sorry, could I just open the door?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so here's a few practical and theoretical issues that we might want, or people might want to investigate. So like thinking about how do we integrate forest gardens in whole farm systems to make them work better. Following the David Jack's approach, as he started on working on a pattern language, which is a really interesting way of capturing and working with that complexity, of site characteristics, needs and resources and functions, so where rather than having a prescriptive approach, like having a choice of patterns that we can apply in different situations, be interesting to move that from purely spatial organization of a site to also think about patterns in time of management and so on, and also social patterns of interaction in and around the forest garden. Then there are lots of long-established food forests in the global south. That's where Robert Hart got the idea from. And it would be really interesting to study them more and basically getting ideas of the patterns of permanence that have made them work sometimes for centuries. So that would be really interesting. Also thoughts about the aesthetics, ecology, functionality in urban and rural spaces, and ideas like commons, like continuous productive urban landscapes as frameworks for developing and basically rolling out forest gardens, if you want. So far at the moment we've got a starting emerging network of practitioners that have land, have a lot of practical skills and a lot of interest and enthusiasm in doing it, basically engaging with this. We've got a beginning group of researchers that have interest and skills as well to bring along, and so we can start collectively evolving those methodologies. What we've got very little so far is basically all the research that's been going on so far very much has been off people's own back, because they were fired up about it, because they had their own personal ideas that they wanted to see to develop. So imagine what we could do with a properly funded program, so that be a lot more could be going on. Finally, summary: forest gardens are, and you can read it. So, thank you very much. That was it.